My name is Dylan. I'm in rabbinical school. I'm a male to female transsexual. I am Asperger's. I'm dyslexic, blind. I'm in a wheelchair and have epilepsy and non-epileptic seizures. I'm a musician and filmmaker and I have a BA in history and MBA in music business.
My name is Margot. I study biology at Penn State Harrisburg. I have spastic cerebral palsy, which is a type of traumatic brain injury.
This video I would like to discuss with you all my evolution of how I interact with God, which has changed over time. I will also be using different names for God throughout this video. The name I am most comfortable with is Hashem, meaning the name, because in Judaism we do not say the name of God out loud. I will be looking at the issue of my connection to Hashem from the perspective of my autobiography and the medical, social and moral models of disability and the realities of biology. When I was a kid, before I started Hebrew school, which is usually defined as by the program I went to, as Sunday school for Jews, but some Hebrew schools meet as after-school programs, and I did not start Hebrew school until I was 9. I celebrated all Jewish holidays at home, and since I had people close to me who were good at history and watched history documentaries on Jews from the age of 5, I knew Jewish history and about Jewish foods, but there was little of belief in Hashem. I was also aware of comparative Jewish theology with different interpretations and spent my life with all different types of Jews, from secular to Orthodox and Ashkenazi and Sephardic, who were from Arab countries as well. When I was 9, I was enrolled in a special education Hebrew school and went to some children's services in the conservative movement, so those people were more religious than my family and knew more than I did at the time. I did not like the children's services because of the sensory overload from my Asperger's. The Hebrew school was a special education Hebrew school. Although Hebrew school is usually to prepare for a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, we learned to celebrate holidays and Shabbat correctly. Learning Hebrew was not emphasized except for Hebrew reading, so I learned the Hebrew alphabet despite being mute. So we did have a general sense of Torah, and outside school I learned what the Torah and what the Talmud was. Granted, as a kid I wasn't that interested in learning Hebrew. I really enjoyed the community of Hebrew school because my classmates were disabled and I was respected and integrated in a way that many disabled people never get to experience. It cultivated a connection to Jewish peoplehood, but not Hashem. When I would come home I would refer to Hashem as the mythical boss. Ultimately nobody really cared about the idea that I called Hashem mythical boss, but I really enjoyed Hebrew school. Although the Hebrew school I went to claimed to be a very holy place and claimed to teach us the letter of the law, and this was clearly not true because they taught us not to drive on Saturday, knowing most of us did. By the time I was 12, I had been in Hebrew school for 3 years. I began to get a little bit bored because the other kids seemed younger and the material was repetitive. So I was moved to the older class, but it did not help much, and then I had to prepare for my bar mitzvah that I chose to do in English instead of Hebrew, which was bold because I was selectively mute and nobody knew I could talk. To give myself a break I delayed it 6 months. When I was 11 years old, my spiritual cocoon began to learn of anti-Semitism and Jewish isolation. Culturally, even if certain individuals were not Jewish, my home overall was Jewish, so I was not exposed to outside pressures. However, this changed at age 11, where everything was turned on its head when I went to Andrews, my first residential treatment center where most people were not Jewish. I experienced ignorance from others regarding my religion and the ideas and values that my community hold. Most people also did not realize I was Jewish because I was selectively mute and partly because of ignorance. This is why the notion of Christmas was pushed on me by Andrews, and learned despite not being able to communicate I had to fight because it is an honor to be Jewish. When I first arrived it was 5 days before Christmas and they had a rule of me not going home for 6 weeks, so that made things difficult because Christmas is not my holiday. It was thought by the school that I should be included in the Christmas celebration, and since someone donated presents they should simply put Hanukkah wrapping paper on the gifts and put them under the tree. At that point I ran out of the room crying because I knew this was immoral and on a spiritual level that Jewish people do not pray to false idols. When I was in residential I was forced to go to Christmas parties and people thought strange things like that I was only half Jewish, which is not true, and that I was not educated on being Jewish when I absolutely was educated. When I was 14 or 15 my isolation came to a head. Because of circumstances of my bipolar I ended up spending Yom Kippur at Andrews, which was a nightmare. Although I was there for Yom Kippur my parents gave me food I could eat before Kol Niddah, but I was depressed and withdrawn from my own spirituality and nobody understood what Yom Kippur meant to the Jewish people, so they treated it like a regular day. when I wanted to go to a children's service but I was told no. They did not understand that everyone goes on the high holidays, especially Yom Kippur. Even though prior to this point I was less religious to the point of almost being reform. I prayed in English and at 15 I went to a record store on Yom Kippur and was basically an atheist. However, when I was 9 in Hebrew school, even though I did not grow up fasting, I was not comfortable with going to McDonald's even though a member of my family liked it. The next 4 years was spiritually uneventful except sleeping through a few bar mitzvahs. When I was 19, everything changed forever with my sense of spirituality because I got an opportunity that generations of Jewish people would have only dreamed of. I got to go on a birthright trip to Israel for people with Asperger's. In the past before birthright I did not have much interest in prayer, but I always had a huge interest in Jewish history. On birthright I began to think of Judaism in a new way. I enjoyed praying every day. Birthright was conservative but egalitarian, unlike where I was bar mitzvahed. The rabbi of blessed memory was not egalitarian. There were fights at the synagogue over being egalitarian that the rabbi was against. So the egalitarian thing was new to me. They edited prayers to be more feminist. When I was on birthright I purchased my first pair of tefillin. I now have 3 pairs of tefillin. When I got back I embraced egalitarianism and conservative and constructionist Judaism while still claiming to be an atheist. I was attracted to Reconstructionist Judaism as the folkways of the Jewish people connecting us, as an aspi. I went to Shabbat services and tried to wrap tefillin but it was hard because I could not read Hebrew. This is when I started attending a progressive conservative egalitarian synagogue. Usually oftentimes people who go on birthright are in college but I was in high school because special education goes up to 21. 6 weeks after I returned from birthright, I had to take the Global History Regents exam. On this test for my essay I focused on my time at birthright which I enjoyed doing. I wrote an essay on women and tefillin where I made sexist due to the prayer said by men of thank God I was not born a woman. I no longer agree with these views which I will go into detail about later in this video. Very few people knew I was going through a spiritual transformation because the high holidays were over and I did not know Shavuot existed, so no one knew about my spiritual journey. By the end of the year there was talk of me going back to Israel to study at yeshiva or work on a kibbutz, but I could find one that was accessible. At this point it became time for me to pick a college to go to study audio engineering, and based on how things were advertised there were not many ways to explore my spirituality because I was only in high school. So I figured I had to wait, but I was not told about not all Hillels are made the same. I thought Hillels were for people of that age and all schools had a Hillel, which was definitely not true. I realized quickly that I was 40 years younger than people at synagogue. When I graduated from high school and pursued college thinking all colleges had a Hillel, I picked Lichmadia Community College, which did not last long due to disability, so I went to Kingsborough Community College which had a Jewish community, but there was something I forgot to factor in, which was that although Kingsborough had a Hillel but it was limited in terms of events and was Orthodox, and I did not handle the situation well socially by trying to be progressive and pushing egalitarianism, so I was not well liked, which I take responsibility for. At this point, after socially having problems at the Hillel and having no luck at the synagogue for other reasons, I decided to try another progressive synagogue in the area. So I asked the rabbi what to do at the new synagogue and she suggested going to NYU or Columbia, but in retrospect it caused logistic problems when I took her advice. I started going to the NYU conservative minyan, which I enjoyed, except I had social issues and logistic issues. Socially I wasn't a student at NYU and studied abroad, so I had nothing in common, and if they would be there a month later, I was still living at home, but they lived across the country and they were able-bodied, but that made it awkward. I was proud of my special education background. Logistically there was a problem because the minyan was held in different locations and I did not know the campus. Over time I tried to push myself into NYU because it was a good Jewish community, and students shared my interests in rock and roll and progressivism, but there was no way for me to attend NYU as a student financially or educationally, so I offered to pay the Hillel but they refused. Having said this, after going through one and a little bit of a second semester, I had a meeting with the NYU admin and asked questions, and they informed me they could not help because I was not a paid student, and within the Hillel itself rules kept changing, so I figured they would kick me out, so I figured it was better to leave voluntarily and go to Columbia, which was different from NYU. At Columbia they had one thing NYU did not have, which was a Saturday morning service, while NYU only had Friday night service. So in turn I was able to attend Saturday morning service at Columbia. At Columbia I had similar questions minus access to the building. However, I did have concerns. There were a lot of people at Columbia, so I was worried about liability if something happened to me, and the college had no record of me, so who would be responsible? At Columbia I grew spiritually and I learned a lot, especially since many people attended JTS and were more religious. Accessibility was a large concern and their disability knowledge was bad because they called disabled people crazy and special needs, which I found offensive. At this point, after trying hills and shul hopping, I had to deal with a new issue, which was my life-changing diagnosis and treatment and consequences affecting my life forever of gender dysphoria, which has spiritual implications as well. Spiritually speaking, when I got diagnosed, there had to be a question asked of, did Hassan make me a woman before God? I'm a male to female transsexual who sees herself as a woman, but never had dysphoria regarding my Jewish practice. I experimented with wearing a yarmulke all the time at one point, but people thought I believed in God, so I freaked out and stopped. The services I attended were all different types. After going to all these different environments and being discontented, people asked if this was worth it, which only made me want to do it more, and people refused to acknowledge that I believed in being Jewish and wanted to be the best conservative Jew I could be. At this point I moved out at 24 from my family home, where I made a spiritual commitment to keep kosher, and people around me were vehemently against and shocked about. Keeping kosher was not easy because the food I tolerate is extremely limited. However, I really enjoyed learning kashrut through trial and error and light. When I got my tefillin and experienced Tablism, I developed spiritual discipline and spiritual sacrifice. In order for me to keep kosher, I had to deal with the fact that I had to change to different brands, which was confusing. After a while it became second nature. At this time I did not have much input from rabbis, but at the Hillel I heard of open events at rabbis' houses, and one rabbi said I should pursue rabbinical school because I was interested in disability rights. At that time I did not think I had the social skills for rabbinical school, but my spiritual needs were obvious even if their knowledge of disability was lacking. By this point I was living alone and I started attending an LGBT synagogue in NY. I had started to become disillusioned with some of the things I was hearing about LGBT in the service itself. One of the rabbis made a series of claims that were not true. Later in this video I will discuss my scholarship, but even I knew LGBT was not top priority in the Torah, yet this rabbi claimed LGBT rights was given and part of Judaism. However, this was a virtue signal, so I did not think highly of the rabbinic leadership. As I became more skeptical of LGBT synagogues in the area, I began to expose myself to voices through my transition that were not progressive voices. Hence began my walk away story, and I suggest you watch that video on how I became fiscally and socially conservative. Spiritually, I noticed I was ignored and tokenized, and they pushed political ambition. The rabbi told a story of kids giving presentations on left-wing issues the kids did not have a choice on advocating for. After living on my own for 2 years and attending an LGBT synagogue, one Shabbat I was kicked out. I did not always know what was happening in the world because I barely went out and I did not have access to social media or print media to keep up with news and current events due to dyslexia and low vision. I did not know what was about to happen. The Shabbat I went to was quite funny because the rabbi announced no one was allowed to touch each other, so I thought they were appropriating autism. I did not know about COVID-19, which is not to discount the deaths caused by COVID-19. The next Shabbat I tried going back and I was turned away because the synagogue was not allowing anyone in due to COVID-19 lockdown and told to watch a live stream. I saw this as a betrayal and insulting on a spiritual level. I knew they had a live stream anyway, but I felt it had nothing to do with me and I was not breaking any laws. However, COVID was different because all conservative synagogues had no in-person service, which I found abhorrent because we were not conserving anything by telling everyone to use the internet. So spiritually, in order to uphold my observance, I davened by myself with an audiobook, which is only an accommodation. I davened by a lake in Queens because I find it soothing to pray in nature, and I saw raccoons. There are people with severe disability who cannot attend in person, so their best opinion is to have a minyan in their house for a male or for a female not attending synagogue. For severely disabled women, for festivals like Rosh Hashanah or Purim, someone male should go to her house by the bedside if need be on her behalf. After 6 months of COVID, it became time for the high holidays. I found one synagogue that was open in Queens and attended. It was okay at the time. However, my theological evolution did not end there. Because my food impairments meant I had to go to upstate to eat, and in upstate the only synagogue was Orthodox, which was fine, but my family was against it, so I prayed by myself. After 2 months in December I find out my days of living in NY had to end ASAP because I lost my housing subsidy and decided to move to Austin TX. When I did research on where to live I looked for Jewish community. The kosher market was an hour from where I was living, so I made Shabbat dinner for myself every week. It turned out there was a minyan that met in my dorm building which was a mix of modern Orthodox and conservative, which was fine except a student disclosed my transition without my permission, and due to transition and the weather I wore a dress, so I was yelled at and kicked out. The Hillel at the college was not open yet either. I liked that this group did not bother with COVID rules, which was better for me. I attended one Shabbat dinner outside. By this point I went to the Hillel despite complaining to the dorm about transphobia at the minyan that I had a right to because I lived there. From my point of view, since I lived upstairs, I felt I could attend any way I wanted because it was my home. I would have handled it with more noised in a public synagogue rather than my home. Prior to this, before attending the minyan in the dorm, I did attend 2 Zoom services to learn about the community, having just to know the community, and I hated it, and found it spiritually conflicting because the rabbi claimed they were together when everyone was actually in different locations. The metaphor of us all being together did not compute with my autism, and it was distracting to me to see chat messages and hear dogs and screaming kids in the background. Then the Hillel opened up. I started attending and was the oldest and most observant, and went there on Shabbat and services and events because I was a student at the time. I prayed with the conservatives at the Hillel, which was okay but not consistent, and sometimes they joined the Reform service, but at least there was no Zoom service. 6 months later the high holidays happened and I went to NY for Rosh Hashanah, so I was forced to attend Reform service with my family, and in the morning service I started crying because I was forced to mask, which was unbearable physically and mentally, especially since I never wore a mask in TX and I knew I qualified for a mask exception under the ADA, which a lot of people had issues with on political grounds. But this service I saw many things I was heartbroken by spiritually. The first thing I was heartbroken by was people on Zoom leading the service, and my childhood rabbi would have been offended by this. It was a Reform service, but I still found it offensive. The second thing was it was not spiritual but more of a prayer session for progressives because they prayed for the Democrats. I don't care about their politics, but they should not be engaging in politics on high holidays. The third thing that made it worse was, in view of the high holidays, was the rabbi prayed for murder by advocating for abortion in full view of the Torah, which says thou shalt not kill, which made me very sad. Then after the service it was time to do tashlich. At this point the person I went with saw I was not comfortable, so we had a conversion while going to a lake to do tashlich, and he said I should have been raised Orthodox. And I asked what kind of Orthodox, and he said modern Orthodox because I would have found it more authentic. I thought this was very interesting, so for that moment I ruminated on the issue to think it over, because it was no laughing matter and required sacrifice. Then Yom Kippur came around in TX and I was registered for a Republican event the next day. I went to a conservative service at a Hillel, which was not the best but better than Reform. This Yom Kippur was different because I did a half fast by only eating snacks instead of full meals. Taking on a mitzvah close to fasting made me feel spiritually enlightened, and with each mitzvah I came closer to my Jewish faith. At the Hillel I started questioning around Yom Kippur, the future of me in the conservative movement, because I was not spiritually fulfilled and very uncomfortable but not sure about being Orthodox and had to do something about it for my own sanity. I talked to a rabbinical student and he said if I had questions about rabbinical school to let him know. So I told him I wasn't sure if there was a place for me in conservative Judaism, and I told him the philosophy, which was that Judaism would progress and would conservative simply become Reform, due to the fact that because of COVID there was no recognition of negative mitzvot and summer Shabbat, which my childhood rabbi would have hated. The other reason I was not comfortable applying to rabbinical school yet was I figured I would be cancelled for being a Republican. What the rabbinical student did was ignore my autism and told me I could apply anywhere, but I knew I could not because I was learning disabled and Asperger's, and he continued to ignore my disability. He proceeded to tell me Zoom services and will to modernize was good to adapt, and I told him that was not based in Hawker, and if you do not follow the law you lose your morality and you have to follow the law, as Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who I was still following, said as a civilization we need to follow the law. For Sukkot I went back to NY, where I decided to get a second opinion on the claim I should be Orthodox, since I did not know where I was going religiously and I knew it would have a big impact on my life. So during a Sukkot meal I told others about the interaction regarding my being Orthodox, and I was talked down to and read the riot act of what being Orthodox was. which I found demeaning because the same people asked me if I wanted to be Orthodox when I brought Teflin. I flew back to TX up to Simhostra and nothing came of those conservations yet. By this time I had moved to an apartment in South Austin and heard bittersweet news that affected my life in TX in a huge way, that I would graduate early, which was great academically, but I would lose my ability to pay rent when I lost my financial aid money. When I was living in the dorm, I contacted my rabbi from Birthright because I knew I needed to prepare for rabbinical school, and I began to work with her on things related to conservative and reconstructionist, but I knew I needed more Jewish education and to learn Hebrew. In November 2021, I knew to succeed I knew I needed to study in yeshiva in Israel, which would also help me with my spiritual issue. I found one program that was funded, so I applied to a conservative yeshiva as well as a few Orthodox yeshivas. I was accepted to a non-Orthodox yeshiva that I thought would look great on my resume. However, just before I left TX, I had a lot of health problems I did not see coming, but that are certainly worthy of note. I began to have seizures, triggered by cold water. For whatever reason, my mental health was also affected as I left TX and went to NY for 2 weeks to see friends, since I wasn't sure how long I would be in Israel. My bipolar became worse. I did not have access to bipolar medication and had no way to obtain them or adjust to them, and I had lost my apartment, so I simply figured I would go to Israel and immigrate there to get health care to treat my conditions. It ended up taking much longer to find out what my seizures and this bipolar life episode was. Watch my neurodivergent genetics journey for more on that part of the story. For these reasons, I continued, knowing the risks with my plan to go to Israel, because at least money would be provided, or so I thought. Due to travel bans from COVID, I could not go to Israel right away, so I went to Miami to wait until the ban was over. What happened at the yeshiva was not what it was portrayed as. 1 month after I arrived, I was told the yeshiva fell through and I lost the funding, so I asked myself what I was going to do with this situation. I paid, so I stayed in Jerusalem for the first month and then went to a hostel that had free classes. I took a bus from Jerusalem. The first time I stayed in an Airbnb close to the hostel. I was treated very well. People were confused by my being trans but were nice, and I learned Tonya. I was thrilled to start my studies despite not liking Shabbat. My job was to learn with an open mind. After spending time in Tzfat, I decided to move to Tzfat. I went to Tzfat to a long-term Airbnb, which was life-changing because I spent time with the Orthodox and Indian Jewish community because my host had connections. I contacted my rabbi in the USA and told her that she could recommend books I could study. I studied for 8 hours a day with a screen reader and prayed regularly. I learned by immersion. I started with Kabbalah, online, and finished in only 1 week. I read the Talmud in 1 year. I read in the span of 6 months the entire Torah with a screen reader. I started studying Jewish law. By this time I also decided that during my studies I should take on more mitzvot. I was already wearing a yarmulke all the time, but now I had my first tzitzit and was honored to be reminded of the 613 laws. There was one Shabbat where my gender dysphoria was out of control, so I wore a skirt. On the same day I went to a service I will never forget where they did not care if I wore a skirt, and they did not care that an Azanzi was praying with Indians, and it was very spiritual. As a part of my time in Tzfat, I went for a walk in a seminary where Rabbi Issa Gloria and Rabbi Joseph Caro are buried, and thought of how I wanted to be like them as a rabbi. I was falling a lot because my knee pain from Lyme disease progressed to both legs, but I felt closer to what it meant to be Jewish than I ever felt before. I know now the falls were related to ataxia. Although I was guaranteed to get Shabbat lunch and dinner, I sneaked away one night to the hills of the Galilee to pray the Shabbat, which made me spiritually informed. At this point I started to make a decision that I wanted to be Orthodox. After experiencing transphobia and homophobia in Tzfat, in that they were saying gay people do not exist, I moved to Migdal Hayamik near Nazareth. I decided to leave Migdal Hayamik after only a month and moved to Haifa. Haifa had its issues, but it was beautiful and had a boardwalk. By the time I moved to Haifa, I had a lot of health issues. Academically, I was becoming proficient in biblical Hebrew and beginning to pick up some modern Hebrew conversational things. Haifa had better public transport than most other places in Israel and had an accessible train. It was the time of year to prepare for Passover. I was to meet up with some people close to me in Jerusalem and even see the priestly blessing, which I was extremely excited for. The trip was extremely difficult. There was no food I could tolerate at the Seder, but I went to the shuk to get food like matzo and butter and potato latke. However, there was no microwave at the hotel and the first Seder fell on Shabbat, so no places that accommodated my limited diet were open. I got through the Seder with schnitzel that tasted like and looked like coal because it was made with matzo meal to be kosher for Passover. After the Seder I stayed post-Shabbat for 3 days to attend the priestly blessing at the wall, which was very meaningful. I was minding my own business when someone asked if I was a man or a woman in an aggressive tone because he clocked me. So I told him I was a guy just so the situation would not become dangerous. When I got to the wall I felt inner peace praying, even though I can't put notes in the wall because I cannot write and have never been to the wall with a scribe. By this point, after the first 4 days of Passover, I returned to Haifa and the Airbnb I was staying at, where my health took a turn for the worse. My chronic leg pain was so bad. Unfortunately, I was hardly able to walk and I had no crutches despite looking everywhere for a pair, and my ibuprofen no longer worked. I began to live like a physically disabled person by sitting to do my ADLs to do something about my pain, like sitting to brush my teeth or take a shower. By this time I realized my body was getting so bad, I was passing out. I had to call an ambulance, which I did not have insurance for, so it continued the trend of me being thrown out of hospitals. I wasn't sure if I would die in Israel in my Airbnb by being found dead from a seizure or something worse, or starving to death. I had to return to the US and will explain later in this video why I was right. Unfortunately, my flight was 3 weeks away and I had to pay all the fees for vax and COVID testing myself. This meant for this 3 weeks I could not use my SSI for any reason at all. This meant that while I was in holding to go on my flight, I barely had any food except one meal of French fries and pudding per day. I also had a continuous migraine for all 3 weeks. Luckily, I found an earlier flight and went to upstate NY, which was extremely hard, and on the Israel side they had no wheelchair, but on the US side, when I was greeted with a wheelchair, I felt like I was being greeted by the red carpet of the ADA. Unfortunately, I had to front the rest of the trip to upstate. For the first 3 days upstate I had food, including a very good Shabbat dinner, which I proceeded to throw up. But I was able to finally hold down food and I got a cane which actually did the job. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. 2 weeks after I started using the stick, I was in for a bittersweet wake-up call, which meant that the cane and I had to part ways. Then I got crutches after being thrown out of hospitals, in which I took a spiritual stand. I visited Binghamton in the past, but did not know the hospital was Catholic that I went to, due to my not being able to walk to a bus stop and needing the ER. After being in the ER I was admitted and it caused a logistical problem because I eat kosher and they unknowingly, until it was too late, admitted me, so I had to eat there and I did not know what hospitals had kosher food anyway. I was fully aware of the Jewish principle of a human life exception where you can break any mitzvah. I felt this was my way to make my stand on kosher food because I had already been forced into an abusive environment where I had no access to kosher food and lived off breakfast food where I was staying before the ER and hospital. And in the hospital because I had to keep kosher, because if I would die I wanted to die a Orthodox Jew. Although I was there to get a blood transfusion, the doctors and nurses who were Catholic were interested in Judaism, so I started teaching them what I was studying in Israel in preparation for rabbinical school. I had a plan to leave upstate due to abuse and lack of health care and lack of a Jewish community to go to South FL. So what I ended up doing to save money was, instead of moving to Miami, I would move to Pensacola. When I moved to Pensacola I continued my studies for rabbinical school, particularly my Hebrew. However, a month after I got to FL my health took a turn again. My leg pain was so bad I needed a wheelchair, so I became an ambulatory wheelchair user. By that point, after being in Pensacola 3 months, I got accepted to graduate school, which did not end my rabbinical ambition, it piqued my history interests. During my time in Pensacola I attended a conservative synagogue, even though I no longer identified as that, just as I had in Haifa, to honor my friend Jason, to say Yizkor and Kodesh for him because he was not Orthodox. In Pensacola there was no open Orthodox synagogue, only Chabad, but I did not feel ready to go to Chabad on a regular basis, because I was not ready to come out to myself as Orthodox, even though I did not agree at all with conservative. It was like a gay man who was out to himself but does not go to gay bars yet. There was one day in the middle of the night all hell broke loose. My leg pain went away, but that meant I could not feel my legs at all. I thought I was paralyzed, but I actually had ataxia.
It appears what happened to Dylan is that her nervous system could no longer tolerate the pain from the nerve damage from her severe lack of vitamin B12, so her brain cut off communication with her lower half of her body as a survival mechanism. Dylan also has ataxia and a genetic condition, so the communication for balance and sensation in her lower body does not operate correctly, leading to a series of cerebral palsy-like involuntary movements that some doctors mistake for purposeful movement that Dylan is not actually aware of. An OPWDD worker thought Dylan had ataxic cerebral palsy. In 2024, Dylan was diagnosed with pernicious anemia, and in May 2025, Dylan was diagnosed with epilepsy, which contributes to the damage to the legs. Please watch Dylan's videos, My Lyme Disease Story, My Neurodivergent Genetics Journey, and My History of Brain Explosions for more info on why Dylan has such a unique nervous system.
Was getting more money from grad school, so I left Pensacola and moved to South FL. So I went on an 18-hour bus ride and the Greyhound ignored the ADA, but I got there in one piece. I decided to not go to a modern Orthodox synagogue until after the high holidays, but once I went to a modern Orthodox synagogue I felt like I was where I was meant to be spiritually, and my being trans was not an issue because they had a gender neutral bathroom and I operated under don't ask don't tell, because I knew how they would feel given how the trans movement was acting, even though it had nothing to do with me. People were nice and it was a success. People did have questions and some offered to let me sit on the women's side, which I politely declined. I got along with people except for the fact I needed a cab because of my disability and had no other choice and could not afford to live near the synagogue. Luckily there were a ton of kosher food options and much better doctors than in upstate, which was particularly important because after I arrived in Miami I had a new very serious life-changing problem, which was over 6 weeks I lost my vision. At first I thought blurriness was from a bad prescription, but when I did eye tests at home I was losing visual acuity rapidly and was now blind, and I was scared. The eyes.
Okay. FP. Well, FPE.
Just those top ones?
The eyes were scarier than my leg issues. I knew modern Hebrew somewhat and was taking a course in it, but my instructor did not know how to work with a blind student, so I could not do much with it. Please watch Behind Blind Eyes for more on this. Despite all these hurdles, I was accepted to rabbinical school, which I found to be very spiritually validating. After davening at the modern Orthodox synagogue, I wanted to become a member, but this was not in the cards. Due to the fact that the rabbi was not comfortable with my being trans, I did not care what he thought of my trans status, but he refused to talk to me to get to know me, which was offensive. 6 months prior, during Passover, I took another blow. I ended up in the hospital with acidosis and almost died, which provided spiritual introspection. All I could think of was when Jacob had his family around him when he passed, and I knew I was getting worse. I decided I did not want to die alone. Those closest to me had a right to say goodbye, and I don't think any human being deserved to die alone, so I decided to move back to NY to have better services for disability and allow my friends a proper goodbye and an Orthodox Jewish burial. After being asked to lead the modern Orthodox synagogue in FL, I tried Shabbat for the high holidays, but unfortunately it did not work out because even though I made a deal with the rabbi for a discounted rate, I was turned away by security, which was very hard. On Yom Kippur I made a decision to do something I had never done. I would try to fast even though I was medically exempt. I knew I had to. It was a personal sacrifice because the fast landed on my 30th birthday, which I did not like.
At the time Dylan attempted fasting, her pernicious anemia was being treated by vitamin B injections, i.e. shots every month, and her blood results were coming back normal as a result. So Dylan's fast was not life-threatening, but not generally recommended by her doctors or by me, who care for her as a friend and advised her not to.
By this point, I had fasted 3 times, which I had never done before, twice on Tisab and once on Yom Kippur. This negative mitzvah opened up the highest level of spirituality, so I now say I'm proud to believe in God and feel connected to Hashem when fasting and everything He does for me. There have been so many times where I could have been homeless, dead or starving, or a combination of all of those. Hashem has always looked out for me and given me unconditional love, and I reflect on that love by wrapping Teflon and doing the negative and positive misbot. This means it is an honor and privilege to serve God. He chose me to be born from the time of conception in the same way he chose Rachel to have Joseph and give him the coat of colors, and he saw Moses and convinced Moses to be a leader of his people, and we are all chosen people. Now that I am no longer an atheist, there becomes an interesting question that a lot of people would inquire about that is very important, which is, am I an atheist by deathbed being? Did I quit being atheist when my body hit the fan since I went blind and lost leg use? My becoming more religious and more disabled have no correlation because I was on the path to be Orthodox anyway, and I went to Israel to study. And while I had an open mind, I was there to settle my religious issues, but it had nothing to do with my impairments. I thought I would become a conservative or reconstructionist rabbi, but now I am modern Orthodox. The next question that is posed is, did God make you disabled, and should that cause animosity between me and Hashem to the point of blaming Hashem for making you disabled? The fact of the matter is I was born disabled and neurologically deteriorated, and genetically speaking my decline would have happened no matter what I did. Depending on what perspective you take, this can be answered in different ways. From the perspective of the social model of disability, a disability is a different way of being and can be accommodated, but this does not mean disabled people do not deserve equality but have dignity and require haste kindness. The great blessing of this situation is in the West, particularly in the USA. You have the ADA and the right to religious freedom with accommodations, and everyone deserves access to their Creator because we are all made in the image of Hashem. However, from the perspective of the moral model of disability, Hashem made me disabled for a reason. In the same way Moses was born with a speech impairment, I was born developmentally delayed and learning disabled with Asperger's and dyslexia. God made me this way in one interpretation to curse me, or a way of tokenizing me, or a way of seeing the glass half full, like in the case of the coat of many colors. Personally, Hashem did this because he saw potential in me, because as Temple Grandin says, autistic people are different but not less. In the way that Moses was and Jacob wrestled in the desert to gain respect, I have gained the respect of Hashem. As far as I'm concerned, Hashem making me disabled is a blessing, because disability does not have to be a life sentence but an opportunity to be the best version of yourself. This is why I am accountable to Hashem in everything I do, like wearing a yarmulke and tzitzit to show I am accountable and honored to attempt the 613 laws, even though on every Yom Kippur, Hashem knows there is no such thing as perfection. Another theological issue, especially since I consider myself to be Orthodox, is the cognitive dissonance of being Orthodox and LGBT. First, I would like to say that this is a sensitive issue to a lot of people, and whether someone does not share your views, please show them respect in the comments and in everyday life, because we are in the image of God and should conduct themselves accordingly. Even if someone does not share my views, I am honored to share my country, America, with that person. For my international fans, I know this issue is even more complicated, and in some places if you show your colors it gets you killed, and every day I pray for LGBT equality like in Israel and the United States. I would like to start with a disclaimer that the world is complex and I should not be defined by the fact that I am bisexual. A lot of people would wonder if Hashem made me a girl, and the answer is no, because I was not born a woman, but rather I was born a man, nor was I born with a female soul. Rather, I was born with gender dysphoria.
Gender dysphoria is and has a biological basis. Gender dysphoria has not been that deeply studied yet, but current studies suggest gender dysphoria may be caused by hormonal changes in the womb during development or genetic mutations that seem to have a link to connective tissue disorders. This does not change Dylan's birth sex on a biological level. So recent studies have suggested that perhaps up to 70% of people with gender dysphoria also have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or similar connective tissue disorders. Part of the reason for this is because the hormone system of the body communicates directly with the connective tissue part of the body and vice versa. So if one of these systems is malfunctioning, so is the other.
This in turn means that gender dysphoria is a mental illness, and since we are all born in God's image and as male and female, so there are only two sexes. In a later video I hope to cover what this means galactically, but being trans is not a factor to be excluded from Orthodox service providing that they practice as their birth sex with accommodations rather than other factors. Consult a local rabbi if you are trans on this issue, as I'm only in rabbinical school. I personally believe that even though I have no malintent, the idea of rejecting a trans person from our Orthodox service is ableist. Because we do not reject Jews with mental illness, and the fact that we do not treat gender dysphoria as a mental illness is a travesty, and because we must take care of our health while we wait for alternatives to these barbaric treatments. For more information on trans treatments, watch The Science of an Inconvenient Rainbow and the Endocrine Disaster videos.
Natural selection is where a species' biology changes in response to the environment. Some of these changes to the species are useful to survival and some are not.
Natural selection is a process that Hashem kickstarted when he created the world. We can only speculate as to the purposes to homosexuality and bisexuality and what Hashem intended, but we know he had no particular intent when he created man and woman because they are two sides of the same coin. Having said this, we can never know the intention of natural selection, but that every generation there is adaptation, and we have adapted to some people being attracted to the same sex. This means that practically, even though man should not lay with a man, we must deal with the evolution that is a gift from Hashem, and that there are public health risks of being gay that do not exist for heterosexual couples. This requires a lot of guidance. Within Orthodox Judaism there is a small movement trying to grapple with these questions, which is liberal for me, but I agree with them on the issue of Hashem in A Journey to Open Orthodoxy, written by Avi Weiss. That we should, like Abraham, bring gay people into the tent, and we don't have to agree with break bread with them, and that does not mean homosexuality is justified or favored by Hashem or Baltic. Due to the fact I am bisexual, I personally do not have to engage in homosexual sex, and made a commitment to Hashem under the laws of family purity that I will only marry and date someone of the opposite sex. I realize for people who are gay that this may be celibacy, which can be damaging to mental health to the point of suicide. I do not have any answer to this, so I suggest consulting a local rabbi, and also check out Cripple Ask Cripple Answer Pride, and I hope to explore this in future videos. I have been through a lot of things in my life that has led to decisions for self-preservation, but this does not define me. I did not always believe in Hashem, but I am and always will be proud to be Jewish. Hashem revealed himself to me through the values of the Torah. I am not ashamed of being disabled or LGBT, even though those communities do not always represent me, because I am an individual which Hashem empowers us to be. It is an honor to serve and love Hashem because he looks out for me. This gives me purpose and makes me want to live. Knowing there is something about me who I am accountable to makes me the best version of myself. I feel blessed every day that my soul is returned to me. This is why every morning we say Moder Ani, and do the mitzvah and make Hashem proud of us.
אני לפניך, ולך נתיים ליישם הסוליס, נבלמה הבא מתמודתה, עמדני הנהר, Yatayam Vasamna Sali Yatavayama Abaminunata